Emil Cadlick here with FantasyNation.com. We have a special guest today, one of the early pioneers of fantasy sports. Started in the early 1990s and was a big part of a lot of milestones of fantasy sports and the business. James, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. We've known each other for many, many years.
Yes, it's been a while. So let's start off first. Well, tell me how you kind of got involved in fantasy sports or the NFL and how that evolved as you were young.
Sure. I remember back in high school in the mid '80s, I first started playing fantasy football, and once I graduated high school, we had a draft that's still going on today. It's our 30th year, and I would go to these drafts like everybody else. I had your magazine, and I would have various spreadsheets and notes written down. And at the time, I was a programmer, and I thought, well, this is clunky. Maybe I'll do something in Excel and write up some stats in that and do projections. And so I did something in Excel and did it for one draft, and it went well. And then I thought, well, since I'm a programmer and I know these computer languages, why don't I just write software? Because there was nothing out there for the draft. So I put together this draft software called Player Evaluation Draft Software and used that 1 year for my draft. And I went through and I put all the projections in there, and I used it to track the picks, which is always a pain when you're a commissioner and you never have time to analyze your own picks because you're so busy tracking others. So this made it a lot easier. With the projections I had on there, it made it a lot better for me to pick the best players and such. And after I used that software, I said, I wonder if other people would want this. Maybe I can sell it. And I put advertising in your magazine and a few others, thinking maybe I'll get a few dozen people to buy it. And I had a couple hundred, and so I was really encouraged by that. And this is, of course, way before the internet. And then people who use the software said, hey, can you write commissioner software? Because what's out there is not that good, and we love your draft software. So the next year I wrote commissioner software. This was back in the days when everything was on a little 3.5-inch disc, and I advertised again in the magazines and got a lot of people that bought the software. And I remember the days just copying disc and putting everything together in a manual and sending it off. And my wife has stories of her spending all day creating labels and such. And after the first year, I was a consultant at that time. I made enough money that I could say, well, let me do this full time for another year and see what happens. And right then was when I did that for a year, and then the internet came out, and I said, wow, this internet thing would be great to have fantasy leagues on there, make life a lot easier. And I hadn't made enough money again for another year to do that and not have to consult. And that went on for about 15 years, where
Wow.
every year I kept making enough money. The internet came around. I wrote my software to work on the internet. And when that took off, then I just spent all my time doing that. And like I said, I think it was about 15 years that I did that full time, and then eventually sold my company and got back into the workforce where I am today. But the start was basically tired of doing things manually, and let me write some software for this, and that just grew.
So with his first draft / commissioner, was that, what time in the 90s was that? Do you remember that closely?
Yeah, well, I mean, I started playing in the mid '80s, and then writing the software I would say around 91 was when I first wrote the software, and in 92 or 93 or I think it was 93 when I first put an ad in the magazine to sell the software, the draft software. And then I think it was 94 that I had the commissioner software.
Wow.
And then that's, again, the next year is when the internet came out, and had software for that. So the early 90s, like 92, 93 was the first year I advertised in the magazine, in your magazine.
Yeah,
I
go
know I
back and
have
look at the
somewhere,
copies.
yeah, I was going to say, I know I have somewhere I have the ads still, and I'll scan them and send them to you
Oh, that'd be great.
because, yeah, because those were I think 2 or 3 magazines I first advertised in, and
Wow.
did it for many years.
That's fantastic. Now you have the first internet fantasy site, fantasyinsights.com.
Yeah, the story behind that was we in '92, I think it was, pre-internet, I created a CompuServe site, an AOL site, and a Prodigy site to talk about my software to essentially advertise on those forums. And for those people that were way ahead of the times, they can actually go to those and download the software from it. But most of it was done all through the mail. And I still remember the day when the internet, which had been around but was never, you couldn't have public addresses like a .com, and they first allowed that to happen, and I think it was late '93. And I thought, well, let me look into this. And right around that time, Jim Lenz, who also had a site on Prodigy, we sort of found each other, and he said, well, I want to do some newsletters, and you have software. I think that'd be a good combination, and can you help me write some of the newsletters too? And we teamed up, and I remember sitting down and writing HTML code to create a website in '94. And it was a combination of fantasy insights and football software where we had both of our products. And I started with him, helping him with the newsletter. And it's interesting, you can go in the Wayback Machine, which goes back to '96, and I can see how bad some of those websites are that we created. But that was what it was like back at the times. And so we put that together, and we started to try to get people to use the internet, email, and that kind of thing to make it a lot easier. But it was quite challenging early on, and I have a lot of interesting stories about starting the internet business up. But that combination of Jim and I creating those newsletters and marketing the softwares would allow the business to grow. And I still remember going to Yahoo and typing in fantasy football, and this was in '94, and we were the only site that came up. There was nothing else out there that has fantasy football, so it was the very first fantasy football site that was on the internet. And we were originally called NFLfantasy.com, and until the day came when the NFL sent us a cease and desist letter saying you can't have NFL in your domain names. And we weren't really going to fight the NFL, so we said, well, let's come up with a different name, and that's where Fantasy Insights was born. And that came out in '96, and when we officially gave the name over to the NFL.
Yeah, I remember you had the NFL Fantasy, and I was thinking, man, I wonder if they're going to get mad at you, and I guess they did.
But, yeah, they got mad. And interestingly enough, after we gave them the domain name, a few years later, they didn't even do anything with it, and it went back to the public domain, and somebody else picked it up. But I'm gonna fight them over that.
Yeah, let's go in there. We're going to flip flop back in time a little bit, but
sure.
The Tropicana Fantasy Sports Convention was a great milestone, I thought, for the history of what we've been doing. Tell me about how you guys thought of that idea and how you put it all together.
Yeah, that was an interesting time. We were not aware of any convention that had happened yet, and we were hearing that people may do something, but nothing ever panned out. And so we thought, well, I'd love to get together with other people in the fantasy sports industry and just talk about what it's like to run a company, and invite them to a convention to speak about the fantasy sports business, and then to invite consumers in there where we can sort of hawk our wares, and all the companies can come and talk about their products. And let's invite some NFL players in, ex-NFL players in, to talk about fantasy football. And the idea came about that, hey, we lived in Vegas, why not look into doing something at one of the local casinos? And we started setting up, and I had my friend Larry McAllister, who took charge to put it all together. Turns out that's a lot more work than I ever imagined. It's a lot more money than I ever imagined. But we got a great response. You were there. This was '98. We reached out to dozens of other companies. Almost everybody came, and we're excited about that. We had a pretty good turnout of people coming in there. We hired an announcer for it, and we had 2 NFL players come. We had the local Review Journal have a front page article about the convention on there. And of course, they had to explain what fantasy football was because most people didn't know at the time. It was interesting at that time. I would say, well, what company do you have? I said, fantasy football. And people would look at you like, what is that? And I remember for many years, you always had to explain what that was. But the convention was a great time because I also got to meet a lot of people in the industry. Some were competitors, but we got and you and a lot of the other magazines were there. And it was also great to talk to somebody else and talk shop and find out what their thoughts are of the industry, where it's going, what we can do to make our business better, how can we draw in more people. Of course, that was the genesis of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, where I believe you were in the room too. We all got together with a handful of people. There were 6 or 7 of us, and we decided hey, we should have this trade association every year and continue these conversations on how we can make the industry better. How can we work together to promote it? Of course, at that time, ESPN, NFL, baseball, they wanted nothing to do with fantasy sports. So we said we need to educate them, and that was the genesis of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association.
So where was this room? Was that part of your convention when we did that, or was that a different time?
Yeah, it was in a Tropicana. I remember get together. Some of the old names like Greg Ambrosius was there, and Christina from the Sporting News. I'd have to go and rack my brain for who else was in that room. But I think there were 7 or 8 of us that got together and decided to keep doing this every year, which eventually turned into every 6 months. And the trade association became a really big thing. And then our focus went away from trying to gather fantasy sports participants and rather just have a convention for this fantasy sports business.
Yeah, because basically it was the FSPA and then it was the Players Association.
Yeah.
And then we morphed it into Trade Association after a few years.
Good memory. And it became that. And now they renamed it to something else too. I just saw recently.
Yeah, Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And Charlie Wiegert was part of that originally, that group, and it just grew. And then other stories come about of how we got ESPN and NFL involved into that. We could certainly talk about it, but that was a very interesting time, and I had no idea that it would ever grow to as big it is now.
Yeah, now I think it was Randy Cross and Tim Green were the 2 NFL players that you had.
That's it. Good memory. Randy Cross and Tim Green. Yeah.
One quick funny question. Do you remember The View? The guy was The View magazine.
Yeah, vaguely.
I'd love to get a list of that. We'll talk later. And he was at when you had one part where you had all the experts up in a row, and every time you called, he answered a question. He would put The View magazine like this, and he'd answer his question. 22 years later, I still remember that. I don't know why. It was hilarious.
Oh my God, that is funny.
McGuire or something. I got his name down. I can't find the guy. I think his name was McGuire or something. I've got it written down somewhere. But
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, you really bring back memories. I do remember that now.
And that was good comedy. He was an interesting guy. You remember Jack Pullman?
Yeah.
All Pro Publishing. I found him.
Yep.
And he was early. He started doing newsletters in the mail in like 86. And so he was one of the earlier ones. But
yeah.
So yeah, that's go ahead.
I remember that. In fact, I think I subscribed to him, and it's same thing with the stats, and if you got into fantasy baseball, the same thing. Everything was done by mail, so you generally be a weekend with knowing how you were doing in the league because you had to wait till the mail to come.
Yeah, or get the USA Today after a while. I forget exactly when that threw in.
Oh yeah.
So I didn't know, or if I've forgotten, if I knew, because I'm old. You sold your software to Real Time Sports in 2020. 2010.
2010. Yeah. Yeah, 10 years ago. Sure. A lot of good stories and a lot of bad stories about running a fantasy league on the internet. And I think sort of the beginning of the end for me, where I decided I wanted to leave the industry, was the real-time stats. If you remember the days of doing the stats, we'd get the paper and the box scores, and we'd look through them all, and we'd do them by hand. And then I wrote this commissioner software that made it a lot easier. There was no internet. So the way people would get their stats was I'd either mail them a disk with the stats, or when the internet first came around, there was a website that they could go to where they downloaded the stats. And that was onto your desktop software. And so you were happy the next day to get the stats, and you wouldn't have to do anything other than download this file. Well, then when the internet came around, and I wrote the site, and everybody goes to their league's webpage, and they download this, and the stats are updated the next day, and people are like, "This is great. I don't have to do the stats. They're updated the next day. I'm happy." Well, then it came, can you do the stats that night, Sunday night, and then maybe do them again Monday night? And it did that, and people were happy. And then over time, they wanted it more and more often. And then other companies started popping up, and then ESPN started doing their stats, and CBS Sportsline, and then CBS Sportsline was another one, and it became doing it every hour, and then every half hour, and then eventually you get it down to minutes and then seconds where you're updating the stat. And that made it extremely challenging to run a website where the stats during Sunday's games are updated every second or every couple seconds. And I still remember seeing all these other sites, including ESPN, fail miserably and this got into the .com area where companies decided we're going to do everything free, and they got a bunch of leagues to subscribe to them, and they had thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of people on their site, and they would be crashing all the time. And I was always proud of the fact that my site never crashed, because I wrote the software that can handle the amount of users in there and still do the real-time scoring. And even the ESPN, I still remember when they had to cancel their season 3 weeks in because they failed. The stats wouldn't update, and that was a crazy time. And a lot of companies were having that difficulty in there.
Do you remember what time frame that was? I don't remember.
Yeah, that was the late 90s, like 90, 98, 99.
Wow, that late? Wow.
Yeah, right. Well, that's when we started getting the true real time, because the internet software started getting popular in 96 and 97.
Yeah, I guess.
And every year we would subscribe to STEM Stats services. Used to be Sports Ticker, and then Stats Inc. We're sending them out, and the challenge was pulling them in and then producing the league results in real time in there. But it became very difficult to have a company that you had to monitor 24/7 the site, because people would go crazy if there was any delay in the sites or the site was down for any time. So it was very challenging. I remember I was a big I'm still am a Houston Texan fan, and I had season tickets from day one when they first came to the Houston, and was it 18 years ago, 19 years ago, and I'd be at the games with my little laptop in case there was a problem. I had to go and check it out. And although I had people working for me, you're always the final say in trying to fix things in there. So everywhere I go during the season, I'd always have to have this laptop. So it was very stressful, and the people were very demanding on having their stats. And so that sort of caused a burnout over the years. And eventually, when it became a hobby and a lot of fun, but then it just became a lot of work. And then eventually I decided, well, I'd like to go back in the workforce and not have this worry about the site anymore. And that's when I decided to sell.
In 2010. So how'd you find, it was Tim Jensen and Mark
Penna.
Is that the people you interfaced with to sell your software to
them?
Or?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was great being in the industry when it came to dealing with other companies that were competitors, but we were very friendly. Mike Hall from FFLM at the time, and now My Fantasy League, we were very friendly, and we would talk every year, and that's where the Fantasy Sport Trade Association was also helpful, because we'd always meet up, and we would have stories about customers and I'd have one customer that was a real pain, and customer service was terrible. He wanted customer service 24/7 pretty much, and he would call me and ask me every year, how do I use the software? And I'd spend hours with them. And eventually I said, you know what, I can't do this anymore. And I remember he said, well, fine, I'm not going to buy your product. And he left, and then he started using Mike's. And Mike, we get together, and Mike's like, that damn customer, what did you put me on him? It's not worth it. I spend hours and hours each week trying to get him to teach him how to use the software and stuff. So we'd have stories like that, but we'd help each other out. We'd talk about how effective magazine advertising was and the internet. And so we were always on very good terms, even though we were competing in a certain way. Although we were more the small-time players, and the big-time players, of course, were ESPN and NFL and CBS Sportsline and such, and Yahoo. But because of such, we had a good relationship in there. When I decided to sell and reached out to them, they were happy, and their game plan of what they were trying to expand by buying my company and getting the customers to convert over fit really well in that. And we did a transition one year where I just moved over all the league information and rules and stuff from my site to their site. So when customers logged in one day, some of them didn't even realize it was a different site. So we made the transition very smooth, and everybody was very happy with the conversion.
So they already had a software and they had yours, and they kind of brought them together a little bit?
Yeah, they were bigger than me, and they also did other sports, and they had nearly as many features as I had, but not quite as many. So they enhanced their software to add the features that were missing to it, and so when we converted over, it was pretty much seamless for the customers.
What code language were you writing your software in?
The desktop software was Visual Basic.
Oh, okay.
3.0, and then when I went to the internet, I wrote it in .NET, and I think it was C# and such, and I had some help to build that out too. But it fit right in because when I was consulting, that's the language I was coding with, so it made it very easily in there. But it was a lot more challenging back in the time because of the internet, and I have some horror stories of having server problems, setting them up and such, because people at that time weren't very good at handling large volume of customers on an internet site. So there was a lot of learning on my part to get into the servers and the hardware and infrastructure and such.
So it says you did some weekly columns for newspapers and a radio show or something like that?
Yeah. It was in Houston. I lived at the time, and a local radio station, and I was in a lot of experts polls and things like that, and writing some columns for various newspapers about fantasy football. And one of the local radio stations contacted me, Sports Talk, and asked if I can come on for a segment or two. And they had so many people that called, way more volume than usual, that they said, can you do this every week? And I wound up doing every week for 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
And that's when people started seeing the real power of fantasy football and how it helps the NFL and how it helps these sports stations. But at the time, we were still struggling with ESPN and NFL wanting anything to do with fantasy football. But it was things like that, radio shows and TV shows, that got a lot of audience that made them reconsider.
Yeah, it was an interesting evolution in the mid-'90s where the NFL was just panicked. They were afraid it was like gambling or something. And
yes,
A, they were just so afraid of it. And B, I think they were so arrogant that they just thought it was annoying, especially teams' PR groups were getting calls from everybody, including you and I, asking about injuries and who's going to play, and that just drove them nuts. I'm surprised it took them so long. I apologize for being mean. To finally go, oh, gee, maybe this is actually helping us. Maybe we should market to fantasy people. I don't know how many decades it took them to figure it out. But when they did figure it out, they wanted to take it over. They didn't ever want to work with us.
Let's talk a little bit about that. And this is where, to this day, I can't say I really have a fondness for the NFL the people behind the scenes, and there's many, many stories I can talk about, but there's just that what you're saying is 100% accurate. When we had conversations with them early on, and I was in a unique position because I was using NFL stats, and there was always this debate between them whether we need to be licensed to have stats. And you should get Charlie Wiggert in here, and he can go into a lot of detail on that.
Yes.
But there was NFL and the MLB claiming that to use stats, you had to get licensed. And when we would talk to them about fantasy football, as you brought up, they thought it was gambling. They wanted nothing to do with it. They didn't see the benefit of it. In their mind, they wanted to shut all the fantasy football companies down. And MLB was the same thing in there. And I remember reaching out to them to say, well, we don't agree we should be licensed, but is there a middle ground? Can we be licensed and not charge so much? And they were adamant that they wanted 15% of your gross to be licensed. It was a ridiculous number. And they would send us these contracts along with a cease and desist every year, which I still have copies of those letters.
Cool.
For 5 or 6 years, or maybe more, we all would get them. And we just kind of ignored them. And I'll leave Charlie to explain how this played out, but it was a big court case, and NFL lost because of their arrogance on there. And it went from, hey, you need to be licensed, and they lost the court case, to, oh, now we're stuck. We can't get licensed people from anymore. And there was a handful of companies that were getting licensed, so they were generating some money that way. But they were so difficult to deal with. And I remember having conversations, me and especially Greg Ambrosius, about fantasy football is great for your industry. It gets more people to watch, it gets more merchandise, and they just refused to believe it. They didn't even understand what fantasy football was, yet they were suing us or sending us cease and desist letters over that. I remember having conversations with them, and a particular woman from BAM, the Advanced Media, who Greg and I were sitting at lunch, and she was going off on us and yelling at us in the middle of this restaurant that you need to be licensed, what you're doing is illegal, and all that stuff. And we were talking to her and about how the stats were used in the software. And she was asking us questions. And remember, Greg and I looked at each other and we go, she doesn't have any idea what fantasy football is.
No.
And we asked her she knew it. She goes, no, but I know you shouldn't be using stats for it.
She was a mouthpiece for him.
Yeah. She was, and
LaShawn Lawson.
Yeah, so getting to that was, we would tell the NFL every year, come to the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. You'll see all the people involved. You'll see how this helps the NFL. No, it's gambling. We're going to sue you, blah, blah, blah. Finally, we made some headway, and they said, okay, we'll send a representative to your trade association, and we'll see what's going on. So here comes LaShawn to the trade association, and we were very wary about why she was coming because we didn't get good vibes from them. And she comes in, she's very cordial, and we see her going to every booth at the trade association and taking everybody's cards and not even talking with them, just picking up their cards. And Greg and I go, we know what she's doing. So we walked over and says, you got to get out of here. We know what you're doing. And she left. And sure enough, we were right. A week later, all the people that she got cards from got a cease and desist letter saying, you can't do anything with football. It was not only the sports, the commissioner software, but the newsletters, everything. They were claiming you need to be licensed for all that, and you need to stop immediately. And that was the NFL's attitude towards it.
I
took
remember
a long time.
Yeah, I remember the one in Chicago. I think that may have been the one. And I had a booth next to William Del Pilar, KFFL.
Yeah.
And they were running some leagues. And my recollection, which may be completely wrong, is she asked him if they ran leagues. And he said, oh, yes, I have some leagues. And she just started a year illegal. And, of course, you know William Del Pilar. He was not very happy. He got pretty upset.
He could be animated. Yeah.
Yes, he could be animated.
Yeah, a great guy. And we had many conversations with him over the years. And so in fact, now you're jogging my memory. That's when we realized what she was doing when that incident happened, and that's when we kicked her out. Yeah,
that was a pretty dynamic point. The other thing that some of the history that's kind of been forgotten, and I found out later, because obviously Charlie got in a position where his business is going to be out, so he had to fight Bam, and I don't know if he fought both of them at the same time, but I think he fought Bam and won. But before that, actually, there was a lawsuit from the something to deal with the NBA and a cell phone, where the NBA or some group was doing real-time stats on a cell phone. That went to court, and what the judge determined, and this is off the top of my head from 20 years ago, that when a play occurs, basketball, football, whatever a play occurs, when that play is finished, it's history, and therefore it's public domain. So not only can you run the stats, but as soon as you put a stat out, the play had already happened. So, quote, real-time data on a cell phone is really historical, because you don't tell the play until it's done. When that shot's shot and it's done, and it's a miss or a make, they can put that up in real time, quote, real time, and it's historical data, and it was legal. And that, I'm sure that helped Charlie win his case. Is basically look at the precedent that's already occurred. Now everybody wanted to call the lawyers heroes and all this, and of course it was a very important case to win. But there was already precedence out there. People didn't know about it. Well, the average person didn't know about it.
Right, and so that helped. And then they took the tack that, well, you using the players' stats would be like getting a shirt and putting Manning on the back. You can't do that. That's the players' rights and their image. And they were then tried to claim that you were using the player's image and therefore need to be licensed.
Yeah.
But they were very arrogant in the approach they took. And I spent hours and hours talking with copyright lawyers and patent lawyers and all this stuff. And they would say, we don't think they have a case. Possibly if they go down this one route, if they're smart enough, but they weren't smart enough. They didn't go down this certain almost loophole they could have found in there. So they just went in front of the judge like we're MLB and the NFL, and we could do whatever we want and demand whatever we want. And the judge shut it down. Yeah. And Charlie spent a lot of money. The FSTA contributed.
About $40,000 we contributed.
Yeah. And the sad part was, if you don't know the story behind it, Charlie was the one person who was licensed all these years. And he had the salary cap game. Remember those?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And he said officially licensed by baseball and by the NFL. And he'd get licensed. And if you remember the trade associations, we would sometimes eventually when we got the NFL to come and baseball to come, they would have these question and answer sessions. And they would talk about licensing. And Charlie would always go, why am I the only one that's licensed? And why you're not going to these other companies? And they always go to Charlie, well, tell us what companies are not licensed. We'll go after them. And he goes, okay, but I do this every year. Here are my competitors. I'm paying you all this money to get licensed, to have an advantage, yet you're not going after these ones who are not licensed. And they'd always promise them every year they would do that, and they would never do that. Again, a lot of it is just their arrogance. And Charlie finally one year said, forget it then, I'm not getting licensed anymore. So they turn around, and who do they sue? They sue him.
They sue him. That was it was the deer in the headlights. He was there.
Yeah, we were just blown away that he was doing the right thing for probably 10 years, paid them millions of dollars. And when he finally says enough because they weren't helping his cause and going after the ones who weren't licensed, they wind up turning around and going against him. And we all stood behind him and did what we could. And it was a tough time. And they lost the case. They appealed. They lost the case again.
I didn't know they appealed it. Oh, that's interesting. I don't remember that.
Yeah, the state court. And then they lost that, and they found out they couldn't appeal it any higher, so the case ended. And in the end, we didn't have to be licensed.
Yeah, I was part of the WCOFF. I don't know if you remember the WCOFF.
Oh, yes.
And they hounded us about licensing. And they were kind of in a position where they wanted to get some people licensed so they could go after more people. So yes. They wanted I don't know what it was, $20,000 or something. And at the time that was a lot of money pulling out of your profit. So Lenny Papano and I said, well, let's do this. We're spending $15,000 in advertising. We'll tell them that's part of the promotion of the NFL, and we only have to pay you $5,000 and they took it. They took it.
Oh, wow.
Because then they could say, we've got licensees. And that was a clever way of us saving some money.
Yeah. But, so you were the reason why they went and sued me then? No.
Did they
No,
sue you?
but I knew they were doing that. They would actually go out and settle with some other companies just so they can put in a list together and say, look, all these other companies are
Mm-hmm.
getting licensed and you should too in there. Even though some of them were getting licensed for almost nothing in there. It was give them more ammunition to go after other people.
It was certainly disappointing in my naive, I'm an electrical engineer, master's degree in electrical engineering. And, I got into fantasy football business, not really being a sharp business person, and I'm still not after 31 years in fantasy sports. So I'm like, oh, cool, the NFL. And it's like, bam, bam, bam. And they could care less.
Yeah.
They were mean. They were arrogant.
Oh
They
man.
didn't want to work with us. And when we won, they just, walked away and, it took them a while. And of course, then all of a sudden, what do we have now? The NFL Network, and half of it is fantasy, whether they say it or not.
Yep.
It was disappointing that they went from being scared of us to being mad at us to trying to sue us and then trying to take our business over.
That was their whole idea with their software. They went to try to go free, and they said we're going to put everybody else out of business, and we're going to be a monopoly, and we're going to do everything, and we're an NFL, and we can. And that was their arrogance, which drove me crazy, that they were just unwilling to work with anybody, even small people like me compared to them.
Yeah.
And the difficulty of, I still remember when they finally did remember we would do surveys every year at the FSTA, and we hired an organization that would always come out and show all the people who are playing and how much more interested they were in football. I mean, who's going to watch a 35-0 blowout in the last 2 minutes? Well, you're going to watch it if you're playing fantasy football because you may have the quarterback and you're wanting to throw some pass at the end of it. They never got any of that.
Or you wanted to watch a game that was a nobody game, but there was a tight end you're interested in picking up.
Yeah.
So you watch the game.
Yeah.
It's short-sighted and arrogant, and I think, God, I don't mean to be mean. I'm just being realistic here. What are you going to do on Sunday morning at 1 o'clock Eastern time?
Yeah.
You're going to watch the NFL. Do we have to market this that much? And I think, well, obviously they figured it out after a while, because I wouldn't be surprised over a period of time that 25% of the growth of the NFL was because of fantasy football.
At least. And those surveys we did showed that. And I still remember when they finally decided to do their own survey. This was in the early 2000s. And this was 7-8 years after the sport already fantasy football became very popular. They did their own survey, and it came back with the results that said, oh, yeah, it turns out that people who play fantasy football are 25% more likely to buy merchandise and 40% more likely to watch their TV. And we all went, duh. It took you now to figure it out? And that's when their whole mindset changed.
Yeah, maybe, I remember the advent of Jerry Jones when he came into the NFL, and he brought in the merchandising. Of course, this was 89, 90 or whatever. This is kind of similar to when you started your growth. But I don't know. Maybe they just didn't have to, so therefore they didn't. And maybe it finally hit them, or they got a little more smarter. I think they're a lot smarter now than they were before, especially if they get this CBA done early, because I think it really hurt everybody, including the NFL, back in 2011 when we had the strike.
Yeah,
and I think perhaps the players and the owners realize we don't want to do that again, because they're really actually working pretty hard at it a year before time. So that's kind of neat.
Yeah, at least learn from that. But I think it's also that some of the younger people took over executive positions in the NFL. And ESPN was the same way. We couldn't get them to cave in on the fantasy football and the benefits of that. So we had it took many years for them to finally come up with a fantasy football show. I remember them saying, I finally admitted that the reason that they had the sports tickers at the bottom was because of all the fantasy football calling them and complaining. And they said, well, at least do that. But we'd bring them to the FSTA. They'd sit up there in panels, and we tell them, why don't you have a fantasy football show? And they would go, we don't think it's going to track a lot of people. And we don't look at each other like, are you kidding me? And they finally did something, and they got a huge amount of people, and that's when they started to slowly change. But it was also when a lot of the younger people who played fantasy football became executives at ESPN and NFL that started to push it along.
It was a generational thing.
Very much so, yes.
Now, also, you pointed out how hard it was to get a merchant account for your fantasy site. Tell us about that story.
Oh yeah, I have a lot of stories about the funniest one was well, I'll give you two stories. One of them was when we changed our name to call it Fantasy Insights, and I had a site called Football Software, and Jim was in charge of the Fantasy Insights one. I'll never forget when we submitted a telephone company to come out and hook up a telephone account for us. This was in the mid 90s, and the guy comes to the door and it said Fantasy Insights on his work order, and he opens the door, and I tell him, "Oh, this is for my fantasy football business." The look of disappointment because he thought we were some porn site because it was Fantasy Insight, and I'll never forget his face, just going, "Oh man."
He thought he was going to
And
get to
that,
look at some bodies, huh?
yeah, that's what some of we faced. We tell them Fantasy Insights, and they thought it was something porn related in there. So when I was applying for these merch accounts, they would, first of all, I had to explain to them what fantasy football was. Second of all, at this time in 94, 95, the internet was, many people didn't know about it. And to them, they didn't know what this thing was. And they said, well, we're not going to give you a merchant account unless you're have a storefront. And I said, well, I'm an internet business. I don't have a storefront. Even Amazon was around back then. Mm-hmm. And they go, well, we don't care. And I remember talking to my call from FFLM, and he would have the same problem. He goes, yeah, I can't get a merchant account. They all think we're not legitimate. They all don't believe in the internet and don't think it's a viable option in there. And I had to go to some small bank where I finally got them to agree to give me the merchant account so I can take credit cards on there. But the challenge was with the internet at the time was not a viable way for selling products. And people didn't trust it. They wouldn't put their credit cards on there. And we ran into that roadblock on there. So it took a few years before I finally got a bank, a legitimate bank, to give me a merchant account.
Yeah, that's something that was really a big deal back then, how difficult it was. And I even think the WCOFF, if I recall, we started taking credit cards in our football diehards and stuff, but I can't remember all the details of that. But we took checks because people had to send their forms in, and so most of it was checks. I'm sure we did some credit cards. I just don't remember.
Yeah, a lot of phone calls dealing with people ordering and taking their credit cards that way.
There was a company I worked with around 2011, which was a little longer after that, but we still were having issues. I think it came and went when there were issues with getting cards. And they wanted to call the company, and they used gaming in the company. They didn't say gambling. They called it fantasy sports gaming or something. And I said, guys, don't use that word.
Yeah.
Guess what? Couldn't get a credit card.
Yeah.
That's gaming.
Yeah.
They thought it was gambling.
Yeah. It's. I mean, you're still seeing this today with the daily sports leagues came into play. I remember them coming to our show probably, 15 years ago. And we're going to do a daily game and such. And we thought, well, that's a lot more luck. And then that's when the whole debate came is we all agree that fantasy football, the normal way it's played, is it's a lot of skill involved in that. When you get to the daily, it's not so much skill. And they were pushing the lines. And we were concerned at that time about whether the NFL was going to consider that gambling. And that all played out. And that's probably a chat for another person. But they really changed the industry in there and got a lot more people involved in it. And we think it was a good thing because people who said, well, I'll play the daily gaming and liked it, then became, well, we'll play the regular fantasy football leagues. And they got more people involved that way.
Yeah, I personally don't like anything that approaches gambling. And so I never really was a great fan of the daily, but obviously it helps a lot. But there's a couple things I was going to say, and I got to be careful what I say. But I think the carve-out language that was in the Congress that may not be valid anymore, I remember reading it very carefully, and it said 2 or more events or something like that, which implied weeks. But at the same time, daily you're using, there's events in the day because you have umpteen number of games in a day for football, I'm thinking, and obviously baseball and basketball. But it definitely pushed the envelope. And then, of course, the real problem with the dailies, they spent so much money that all the states attacked them because they wanted to make money. They were seeing all the money going into the advertising. And that's a story I don't want to get into anymore because I'll start talking about the FSTA and then I'll have enemies. But Patrick Hughes, tell
Yeah.
me about, did he, his patent stuff, I shouldn't laugh, his patent, how did that get involved? Did you get attacked by him?
Yes, I did. And the one thing I learned, and you can probably validate, is when you open up a business and you start to make money, you're going to bring people that are going to go against you and want to get your money. And this is where the copyrights and the patents and things come out, is you become a target for people to make money, I will say, in illegitimate ways. And so the NFL was one of that, but we also had a deal at the same time with Patrick Hughes, who somehow, some way got a patent on fantasy football software and had this on the books. And this gets a whole debate over, can you patent software, which is still a big debate today. But he did have this patent, and he had the first, one of the very first fantasy commissioner. It was products. It was written in DOS. It was okay for the time, but then Windows came around, which made his software really irrelevant because he didn't update it. And for a while, it was called Terry Bradshaw's fantasy football software. He got him licensed, and he was an interesting guy. And him, and he came to the trade association once, and
at least
he had a book. Yeah, he had a book on fantasy football, and it bragged about himself in the book. It was very odd, and he sent us letters, me, Mike, and other people in the industry, including the big players that were getting into like Sportsline, to say, I have a patent, and you need to either stop with your software or immediately deposit $100,000 in this bank account, and here's the number to send it to.
Wow.
Or we're going to come after you. And I probably still got a copy of that letter somewhere too. And we all got it around the same time. So I remember getting on the phone, and I didn't know what to think. I didn't even know about this patent. And I was calling Mike and other from FFLM and the RT Sports guys who were around at that time, and going, what's going on? And they're like, we got the letter too. We don't know. We're having our lawyers look at it. And we go, I don't believe this guy actually has a patent on there. But if you know patents, it's very specific. And he had in there a scoring system. And the patent lawyer said, well, all you got to do is have a scoring system and support something that's a little bit different than what he had in there. And your software can support anything, so you're really not even violating the patent. And they even questioned the legitimacy of having a software patent. And what we decided to do was eventually just ignore what he was sending us. He's not going to go after us. We think we're too small. We don't have $100,000. And if he wants to try to shut us down, fine. And we pulled some of our money together. We talked to patent lawyers. They pretty much said, we don't think he's got a case. But, of course, anybody can be sued for anything. And if he's got a lot of money behind him, you could take you to court and drain you that way and such. So we did try to have conversations with him, which were very interesting. But he more was going after the bigger players. He was trying to use us, to your point before, for leverage, to say, look at all these other companies that have agreed with me and gotten licensed with me, and now I'll go after the sports lines and the ESPNs and such. But it never went anywhere. I remember him getting one of the bigger companies to license, but when I talked to somebody about it, they said, oh, they're paying him barely anything. And he came to the show, and he just thought he had this right to go and brag that he created fantasy football software, and he has this patent, and everybody should pay him. So that was just yet another headache of running a business, and you're having people trying to sue you for a patent and for licensing and such. And it was a lot of headache at the time, but we all got through that part.
Yeah, I remember him coming several times to the trade association, or maybe it's the players association at the time, I can't remember. And he'd get up in front and they'd give him a little speech time, and then people were just like at the edge of their seats. What's he going to say now? I remember he'd say, well, I settled with ESPN, and they're paying me, and I'm just like, how much, and is it really true? And then he finally just went away. And it also is, you understand it probably better than I do, somehow he got a patent. Somehow they let it go through. despite all the history of fantasy sports. So fantasy sports goes back to the late 1950s. I've got documents of the Goppel from 1963 of their whole scoring system and how they run their leagues.
Wow,
so I don't know how
that's
you
awesome.
could take a subset, say, well, I'm going to change the rules a little, but somebody gave him a patent. But the real problem with patents is you have to defend them. And, do you have enough money to run around? Do you remember Jeff Thomas? He had that one software he did where...
you had to bring up that name.
Sorry. And he sent it to me. I mean, he tried to, he had to protect his environment, and I don't know if he ever was successful at it because it was so hard to protect it because people were out there doing mock drafting and things, and I don't know the details of it. But, and I got to be careful what I say. And I'm interviewing him next week, by the way.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy. I'm glad you're interviewing him.
Good.
He was the president of STA for him and Carl. What was Carl's last name?
Foster.
Carl was another one of the president. Carl Foster, yes.
Yeah, they call him Carl Fraudster, by the way, but that's another story. But he was Fraudster. It's a story I'll tell you off camera. But Foster was in for, I don't know how early, because back from '98, but he was in it fairly early. And
him and Jeff were both in it very early. I think they both came to our very first FSTA.
Yeah, could have been. That's interesting. And Krause.
Well, I'm glad you're finding all these people.
I found a lot. There's a bunch. I'm probably going to end up doing probably 40 of them or so. I just want to really do a good job. It just hit me 2 years ago. I was doing the Fantasy Football Summit, and we did this video conferencing for draft prep. And a guy was talking to a guy prepping up for it, just doing a video test. We ended up being on for like 40 minutes, and I'm thinking, wait a minute here. Does fantasy sports have a good historical record of all this stuff we've done? And I thought, video things are nice because they can hear you talk. They can hear your emotion. They can get details that I may miss if I try and write it all or get you to write it all. So, and of course, in modern technology, we can put this on a terabyte and keep it for a few years and get it on the website. So I babble. But so it's been a lot of fun.
It's a really great thing you're doing.
Well, thanks. I'm always doing something in the late winter, early spring that I shouldn't be doing because I should be working on my site and my magazines, but that's me. So I think we got through it all. Is there anything else that you remember you want to bring up that would be interesting?
Yeah, I'll give one a little more depth on why I left fantasy football. Was we had an incident where it's a painful memory, but a kind of sort of an amusing story. I think that as I said, the real-time scoring was very difficult to maintain, and I never once had a problem with the server going down, but I did have problems with the stats providers having hiccups and not sending me the stats on time. Dealing with Stats Inc. is a whole other conversation that does not have good memories because they were, and I'll just say it, they were worse than the NFL in dealing with them.
Really?
And I went with other, like Sports Ticker. I went with a few other places to get stats, but then Stats would buy them, and then they would
and then raise the rent.
They would raise it like anybody you talk to with software, ask them about Stats Inc. and you're going to get a lot of F-bombs. But they were at a whole level of arrogance with them. Yeah. And so I was using my stats from them, and I started getting a delay in the stats, and I can't do anything because I'm holding to them sending me the stats every couple seconds. Well, the stats got delayed, I found out, because of this bug in the program that happened because there was an NFL game that had two players with the same name in the same game.
Oh, boy.
And it caused their stats to blow up. And so a few minutes go by, and I start getting emails. First, they're friendly emails. Just to let you know, your stats are not updated in 3 minutes. This is a big game for me. Can you make sure they're updated? And I'm looking into it and going, oh, I'm not getting these stat files in there. And I contact stats and they say, we're aware of the problem, we're working on fixing it. So then 5-6 minutes go by and the emails start coming in. What is wrong with you people? This is a big game for me. You haven't updated the stats in 5 minutes. I'm getting very angry. And we're talking hundreds of emails that started pouring in. Then the emails went to, this is crazy, your stuff's always broken, which was completely not the case. And you should fire your database administrator because they're not doing their job. Then they would progress to, you're an idiot, we want a partial refund because the stats are not working for 10 minutes. Then they progress to, we want a full refund, then we're going to sue you, then we're going to do a class action lawsuit, then we're going to charge you with a crime because this is false advertising of real-time stats, to, I want you and your whole family to get cancer because I haven't got the stats in 30 minutes.
Incredible.
And I'm not exaggerating. And it got so bad I couldn't even read the emails anymore. The hundreds, if not thousands, were pouring in, all because they had to go up to 30 minutes without getting a stat update.
Which has nothing to do with the final product at the end of the game. It doesn't change their score.
Yeah, right. It had nothing to do with that. After 30 minutes, it went back up there, but people were so angry, and that these emails came, and that was the final straw where I just said, I can't handle this. The people, I appreciate them paying me and using my site, but when you're going to be so demanding like that, it takes a lot out of you, and there was a lot of stress then after that to make sure the site's always running, because anytime something happened, they would send you an email. And most of the times it had nothing to do with me, whether it was this, I can't tell you the emails I got were people arguing the stats of plays. You had this guy running 9 yards, but I watched the game and it was 10 yards, and that's a difference in me winning or losing this game. And I have to tell him, I don't make the stats. They come from NFL. If you want to argue with the NFL. And my God, when there was a trick play or something unique where a player catches the ball, fumbles, the defense picks it up, fumbles again, I would get inundated with emails arguing that I didn't score that correctly. I said, I'm just going with the NFL scored it. But they affected their game. They would argue with me about the number of yardage players had. Oh my God, when they had that game where, if you remember, when the field goal was attempted, a long field goal, and it was short, and the guy caught it and ran it back for a touchdown, which hadn't happened in something like 30 years in the NFL. The emails I got arguing with me, whether that's a defensive score, a special team score, interception return, and it was things like that that really ate into my enjoyment of winning the league.
I can understand.
And having that stress and getting emails like that was really the final straw where I decided to move on.
Well, that's unfortunate that people do that. They are passionate, but to go that far is really sad. I have nothing compared to that in my world, but just as a point, I occasionally get emails, or did in the past, where people would just say the worst things about you because you had something wrong in the magazine or something. Just the worst things.
Yeah.
They'll call you all these names.
Blaming you.
Yeah, and I gulped, and I replied back, and I said, okay, maybe it was a login issue or something. And I said, well, this is what happened. When you typed your email, I looked in the system, you missed a letter, so your login was wrong. I fixed it, so now you can log in. And they reply, oh, you guys are the greatest. I love you guys. You just called me some of the worst names. I could have just canceled your account and put your money back and said, don't ever come back again. I'm like, what is wrong? Do you really have to approach me that way for me to check your account? Which turned out to be his error.
Yep, I had a lot of that. People wanted to vent, and after they would vent, they would be fine and be your best friends. But in the meantime, they're yelling and screaming at you. I had so many people that would claim that they went and changed their lineup, and the system didn't track it. Mm-hmm. And any software guys you talk to are going to give you stories of this, where people were adamant, and I'd have to eventually go and print out logs to show them that, no, you didn't log in and change this at the time, because they were adamant they want. And I had people that would, another quick story. I had one guy that claimed he was the commissioner of his league, and he couldn't get his password back and such, and he was having like issues, and something about his email account got canceled and all that stuff. So I said, oh, okay, well, I'll help you out. And I sent him his password. It turns out he was not the commissioner. He was mad at his league. He got the account information and went in and deleted the whole league.
Oh my God.
And I had all these owners, and the way he did, the way he did this was, I have to correct myself. He didn't say he was commissioner. He had said the commissioner of his league had died, and he wanted to get into the league. So can I please give him the username and password? And it turns out he was lying. His commissioner didn't die, but he used that information to wipe out his league. And so I was put in a position then, if I had people contact me in a similar case to say the commissioner had died, I had to ask for confirmation from other league members that this had happened.
Oh my gosh.
In order to prevent a disaster like that.
Were you ever able to get the league back in, or?
Yeah, I was able to go pull up some backup and restore their league for them.
Good. Well,
and he still continued to try after that to sabotage the league.
Wow.
But it's little things like that you're having to deal with when you have thousands of leagues in there, and all these people are emailing you, complaining, or trying to get around the system, or just basically it comes down, people are upset they lost their fantasy football game and they want to blame somebody or trick somebody into turning it into a win.
Yeah, that's just crazy. Well, James, you're truly a fantasy sports pioneer, all the things you've done. I really like the Tropicana Fantasy Sports Convention. I think it was a great milestone. As a matter of fact, I'd like to do a complete story on that someday. We'll talk about that offline. But congratulations and thanks for the time. We could talk longer, but you probably have to go work or something.
Well, the end story is when I left the industry, I went back into the workforce, and I've been at Microsoft the last 6 years. So I work in New York City. I live in New York City.
Oh.
Microsoft has an office in Times Square. I'm looking out at the Empire State Building from my office.
Wow.
And I help in similar. I'm not a developer anymore, but I help companies with data platform and databases and such.
That's
I'm
fantastic.
sort of a technical salesperson in there. So I've been doing that for 6 years on Microsoft and really enjoy it.
Wow, that's fantastic. I forgot about
it's
that.
a long
I'm
way
glad
from
you mentioned that. Yeah, Microsoft. That's fantastic. Well, fantastic.
Yeah, I went from using their software and now I'm working for them.
Yeah,
so
that's great. That is fantastic.
Yeah. But thanks so much for having me on the show. This is fantastic. I love talking about fantasy football. This is why we started the trade association, because back in the day, you couldn't talk to anybody else about fantasy football because they didn't know what it was. So we'd get together, people like you and I, and hey, let's talk about fantasy football. And it was a great time, and it's gone crazy down there. And I also say they had the Fantasy Sports Trade Association here, I think 2 years ago in Times Square. And I remember walking there and seeing people like Matthew Berry and going, remember when we started the Fantasy Sports Trade Association? We had a few hundred people in here, and they had these big signs, billboards, and all the major companies were there, the ESPNs and the CBS, and we're going, look at how far this has come, that we're in Times Square and thousands of people are here talking fantasy sports. What a change.
Yeah, it's crazy that you've been a part of all that and got to see from the beginning to the end. That's just great stuff.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, sir.
Well,
great talking.
Thank you for having me. I love this, and if you're ever in New York City, let's get together and have a beer.
Sounds good. Will do.